Hi, friends. I'm Amy Julia Becker, and this is Love is Stronger Than Fear, a podcast about pursuing hope and healing in the midst of social division. In this season, we're talking about how we can respond to the brokenness in our own lives and in our society with our whole selves, head, heart, and hands. And today, I get to talk with Liuan Huska about the experience of healing from chronic pain and how it has helped her to think differently about healing, wholeness, and participation in God's healing work in the world. And do stay tuned. At the end of this interview, I'll let you know how you can win a copy of Liuan's beautiful new book, Hurting Yet Whole. All right, well, I'm here today with Liuan Huska. She is the author of Hurting Yet Whole, Reconciling Body and Spirit in Chronic Pain and Illness. And if you haven't had a chance to see this book yet, not only is it a beautiful book as far as contents, but the cover is also really beautiful. I just love it. So, Liuan, welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me, Amy Julia.
Well, for this season of the podcast, I am talking with lots of different people about how we as individuals and as communities can participate in God's healing work in the world. And I'm focused in most of these conversations on the idea of social healing and how we can participate in that using our heads, our hearts, and our hands. And this is not exactly what your book is about. It's not exactly about social healing, but it is all about healing and about what it means to reconcile body and spirit and think about healing in different ways, perhaps, than we've been taught, especially in a Western American cultural Christian context. So I thought your book was a wonderful way into a conversation about what healing is, how our understanding of healing can change our understanding of ourselves, of God, of the world around us. So I'm really excited to get to talk to you about these things today. And I thought we would just start by letting our listeners know a little bit about you and what compelled you to write Hurting Yet Whole. So could you just tell us about your own story, your experience with chronic pain, and how that led to writing this book?
Yeah, so I started having ankle pain when I was 21 years old. I just graduated from Wheaton College and I'd quit my first ministry job at a nonprofit. That was really stressful. And I started having this little pain in my ankle that I thought would go away after a couple weeks. And, started seeing doctors after a few weeks and nothing was happening. Got kind of caught up in I need to be fixed, that this is like a problem and I'm doing something wrong if I'm not getting better. And about maybe 3 or 4 months in, it sort of settled on me that this pain might be something that was ongoing. I'd seen multiple doctors and hadn't really found anything that was, as far as diagnosis or treatment, that was really helping. So that started a whole season of depression and anxiety and asking lots of questions, asking lots of questions to God and also questions to myself about who I was and what my identity was now that I wasn't what I thought I was, which I'd always thought I was capable and productive and that my body could kind of fit into my agenda for my life. And then at that point, it was clear that my body was not going to cooperate. So lots of questions around, am I my body or am I more than my body? What does the Christian story say about our bodies and healing? And what does it mean that Jesus is our healer when we don't get better in the way that we assume we will get better? So yeah, that went on for 3 or 4 years where I was really not able to walk more than a couple blocks. And just limping suddenly just changed my, the way I moved about in society. I was no longer an able-bodied person. Suddenly I didn't want to be categorized as disabled. That was really hard. I didn't want to attach that to me and be that person on the prayer list who was always like had these issues going on or not able to go up and get communion. Talking about, social healing and what does it mean for us to seek healing as part of a social body. So those are all the kinds of questions and things I was struggling with as I came out of that season, ended up getting pregnant with our first child, and for some reason, I think it had to do with the ways that the hormones in pregnancy were shifting my
Yeah.
joints. Got a little better, and that actually gave me the mental and emotional space to start to think about these questions
Mm.
a little bit more. When they weren't so like existential, it made it
Yeah.
a little easier to process. So that's how the book came about.
Mm.
Sort of my frustration with the narratives that I was kind of being given by the church of what healing means, or what it means to be in a body that suffers. Is it any more than you just kind of get better? You're like, you try to like ignore the suffering, or like overcome the suffering, or was there something else that we could gain, or at least be present to in times of suffering?
Well, and one thing I think your book does well, but also that I've just been noticing in recent years, is that chronic pain is a situation that so many people find themselves in. And you bring up this, it's certainly less expected for a 21-year-old who has always been able-bodied to all of a sudden be in that situation, although not unprecedented. I mean, there are lots of people, whether they're young, and certainly for people who are aging, who begin to experience that chronic pain, and the ways in which our society tends to react. I can so relate in my gut reaction of wanting to fix someone's problem, either by like, have you tried medication? Have you tried yoga? Do you know about, like I want to give solutions. What's funny for me is that as a Christian, I actually don't like, prayer is not usually on my list of fixes, which is not to say that prayer fixes our chronic pain anyway, but it's just an interesting thing that I notice how much I've separated bodily pain from God's healing work. And yet I also think that when we do bring it into a Christian context, we can often oversimplify it as well. So it's like we can just, I don't know if getting it wrong is the right way to talk about it, but we can certainly oversimplify, both from like a secular cultural level and within the church, the experience of pain, as well as our understanding of healing. And again, that's what your book does so well, is to begin to unpack some of those questions, not just through the realm of your experience, but in this broader sense. And so my next question for you, I do want to ask you how you understand healing, but I thought that maybe we could start with this idea of pain. Like, how do you understand pain? How would you define it? What purpose does it serve? Like, what is it? What, if you think about it, how do you think about it?
I've actually never gotten that question. That's interesting.
Well,
right. There's so many layers to it. So there's the physical pain, which
right.
Is, I think, on the most basic level, is the body's way of telling you that something is wrong,
Okay.
or that there's something that you need to like pay attention to
Right.
in your body or your surroundings. Often it's a signal of danger, like the like that reflex that we have when we touch a hot stove
Mm-hmm.
is like to jerk back, like we don't want to be there. And
Yeah.
so that's a natural reaction, is to want to get out of the pain. And then when it's chronic, then it becomes like what do you do when you can't escape it? And then do you continue to categorize it as your body's telling you that something's wrong? And if so, then what's wrong? And what do we have to, is that something to fix? Or is it just like, oh, like my body's not kind of responding in the way it should be responding? So that's the big question as I think about pain, that I've had and continue to wrestle with, is like, does it mean that something's wrong? Is like pain a signal that we need to fix something, or are we able to kind of be present to the pain without needing to kind of categorize it as good or bad? And as I was thinking about kind of the theology behind pain, I started going back to like the biblical stories of the creation and the fall, and there's a lot within evangelical Christian circles. I feel like a really common narrative is pain comes out of the fall.
Yeah.
So like maybe before Adam and Eve sinned, that we didn't have pain or disease
Mm-hmm.
or disability or
Yep.
suffering. And then once the fall happened, then all of that was ushered into the world. So that's something I've always wrestled with is like does my pain indicate like some broken state of humanity that I need to kind of reconcile with what God is doing and his work of transformation, or is it something else that I
Right.
can just like accept, like was it there to begin with? And then on top of the physical pain, there's also the emotional pain, which in my experience of chronic pain was actually worse, or like it
Mm-hmm.
entailed more suffering for me.
Mm.
So that's another thing. Like, is there like an intrinsic connection between pain and suffering? Like, if I experience physical pain, does that mean that I'm like suffering all the time, or is my suffering actually caused more by my like approach to the pain? And then I started getting into like Buddhist, Eastern ways of thinking about pain, which are way less like needing to categorize good and bad. And
Yeah.
that was really helpful actually for me to kind of step back and say like, okay, why am I suffering? Is it because of the physical pain, or is it because of the way that I'm kind of like having this vice-like grip on like I need to fix my pain and then it's not getting fixed, so that's what's causing me the emotional pain.
Well, and I wonder there too, thinking in the social terms, because as you know, I have a child with a disability. And so I've thought a lot about how we understand disability and whether suffering is something that's just a part of disability. And one of the things I've recognized, especially because I have a child who physically has not suffered much at all in her life, and that's not always true for people with disabilities, but it has been for her. And so this idea, like even in the media, people will write so and so suffers from Down syndrome. And it's like, that is like literally not true of our daughter. And yet the way in which society sees people with Down syndrome can perpetuate a lot of suffering in terms of loneliness, rejection, and isolation. And I wonder, when you say that there was a social aspect to your pain and like an emotional aspect to your pain, how much that had to do with, without pointing fingers, but like how other people were perceiving you. Like, was that contributing to your pain essentially?
Right. And like you said, with people with disabilities, so much of the suffering that happens has to do with how they don't do or don't fit into society's definitions and ideas of what's a good life and a productive
Mm-hmm.
life and a meaningful life. So I felt like that also plays into chronic illness, that we can start to ask the question like, is this suffering, and maybe are these limits that are causing suffering um, due to like the experience, like the physical experience in itself, or kind of the way that our world works, so that we're not
Mm-hmm.
able to participate in the life of society in the ways that would enable us to feel more supported and
Right.
connected and experience healing.
Yeah. I would love, actually, so I want to come back to some of those ideas. Well, actually, before we do this, I also want to point out, though, you brought up the fall, and it's not just did pain enter the world with sin, right? But also, have I done something sinful if I am experiencing pain, right? So there's kind of this like idea that the world is broken and maybe pain comes and it has nothing to do with our behavior. But I think there's also another narrative of like, well, if you, something must be wrong, whether it's with your faith or with your devotion or literally you actually did something wrong. There's some relationship, either overtly or more subtly, between sin and pain, or moral wrongdoing and pain, that at least within the church can come up, I think, and again contribute to the pain itself, right?
Yeah, I definitely had those same like those questions like, what am I doing that's contributing to this, or what do I need to do differently? Or even if it wasn't about sin, there's sort of the need to attach a purpose to our pain,
Hmm. Yeah.
to what we're going through. So like I'm not saying this was unhelpful, but it maybe was doing more than I think we can do as human beings. So some people would say like, well, God is using this thing that you're going through to refine your character.
Mm-hmm.
And that's probably a common thing within disability
Sure.
experience too, is that, oh, they're like so strong, or like they've overcome so much to get to this point, like as if what we're experiencing, like God intended it in order
Mm-hmm.
for us to become certain kinds of people. And so I also, kind of wrestled with that, like, okay, well, what are you doing, God? Like, how can I learn this lesson so I can get over this now and be
Right.
done with this?
Yeah.
Like, hey, if you're trying to teach me something, then all right, what is it? So I can move on to the next stage of my life. So that was another way to kind of narrate what I was going through that I push against. That I wonder if I don't think we need to have that in order to have our experiences of pain and suffering be meaningful.
Mm. So from there, how do you understand healing, and how has that understanding changed over time? If it's not fixing and going back to, the person I was when I was 20, what does that come to mean for you? And what did it used to mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the the way that I've understood healing, I think ongoing, even the beginning, was by thinking about wholeness
Mm-hmm.
as like wanting to be like kind of complete, And for me, when I first started having pain and I couldn't be in my body in ways that were joyful and life giving, like being in my body felt very kind of like a death sentence in a way. Like I felt really trapped in my body.
Yeah.
I wanted to escape. I felt alone and isolated by the pain. So like I thought, I need to like get back to the way my body was so I can be whole again, because like being whole, like for me meant going out on, bike rides and dancing
Mm-hmm.
and backpacking around the world, and I suddenly didn't have those avenues for flourishing in the world, and I had to kind of think, okay, well, my body is part of me, so then how do I like reconnect with my body if my body is part of me and I want to be like this, like, you know whole complete human being that has all the parts of myself connected. So that's when I started asking more questions about how can we live well and be present when our bodies aren't always like you know functioning at their optimal level, but or yeah, or even just redefining what optimal normal functioning
Right.
is.
Right.
That also really helped me, is realizing that um, there's so many, there's a spectrum of able-bodied and
Mm-hmm.
disabled, or healthy and well. And it's not like we have to be like perfect in order to be whole. And I think that's a common kind of misconception. And that again goes back to the creation story. In my book, I mention, you know, God calls creation good. And so on all, and after every thing that he created on all the
Mm-hmm.
6 days, he says it is good. He doesn't say it is perfect.
Mm-hmm.
So that just kind of forces me to ask the question, like, how is my body still good? And
Mm.
can I find purpose even in the imperfection? So as I've thought about healing, it's continued to just force me to ask, what does it mean to be present in my body? And what does it mean to experience God's purpose and goodness as I am, being able to accept that this is the reality that I've been given, and I can choose to live like as I am, as the body that I am, without needing to wish myself back to a previous state of what I thought was normal.
Well, and I think about within that, you mentioned earlier just the ways in which how we are in our bodies relates to our identity. And again, this is where I think about disability and the ways in which we tend to elevate and then devalue certain types of bodies and types of lives, whether that is based on ability, whether that is based on income, whether it's based on ethnicity, race, class, I mean, all these things, right? And I wonder how much of your self-perception as valuable was linked to what I can do in my body. I know that for me was something that I had to address in having a child with a disability. And I can remember a couple years in with Penny talking to someone who asked me how high functioning she was. And I just don't like the question. Like, I don't want to play into an idea that that she is high functioning because she can speak and read and walk, right? Like, because there's a sense of, what do you even mean by that? It seems as though there's a value being placed on ability to function. And what does function mean for a human being, right?
Exactly.
Like, to function, what does it mean? Does it mean being able to relate to other people, being able to love, being able to experience joy, or does it mean, being able to be a self-sufficient superwoman, So I do think for me, certainly, the experience of disability has led to very different understandings of what makes us valuable as human beings, and even what it meant, if we go back to that story of Adam and Eve in the garden, to be created good. I think I used to think that really meant to be created like Superman, as opposed to be created human, like with limits and vulnerabilities and needs, and the potential for, pain and decay, and yet the potential for love and healing and care within all of that.
Right.
Anyway.
It gets at those basic questions that we ask in every generation of what it means to be human. And is the epitome of being a human being, being able to have this like amazing intellect, or is there something else that's at the core of our humanity that makes us human? And obviously we can look to Jesus as the best example of that. But it's really fascinating. I think about some of the new research that's being done in the biomedical fields, and even like looking back at anthropology and what we've excavated as far as human remains. There's a really interesting New York Times article that someone shared with me called Americans Stop Being Ashamed of Weakness, that came out a few months ago. And they asked Margaret Mead, who was one of the anthropologists from a few decades ago, like, what was the first evidence of human society? Was it like our tool making ability or some kind of like thing that showed off our intellect? And she pointed to like 12,000 years ago, there was a femur that they found that someone had broken a femur and then it had healed. So it was an evidence of a healed femur. And the takeaway she got from that was that this is the first evidence of a human society, because if you had left that person to themselves in the conditions of early humans, they would have very likely, been attacked by wild beasts. But this tribe was able to gather around this human and take care of them for the however many weeks it took for them to recuperate. And that was what showed her, like, okay, we've reached our humanity. Like, this is what it means to be human.
That's amazing. I mean, that makes so much sense, but that's also, it's like such a beautiful image of what we're talking about, that the evidence of a broken bone that has healed is the evidence of love and care and humanity, as opposed to invincible bones, right? Being somehow the marker of that. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Well, so to this point, one of the things I'm thinking a lot about in general, and also in relation to your book, is the relationship between body and spirit when it comes to pain and healing. I was struck, this is well, let's see, page 129, because I wrote that down. You wrote, this is about an experience you had when you had basically been overworking. And you wrote, I learned through this experience that when we push the override button one too many times, eventually our bodies say no. This no comes in many forms: headaches, body aches, tightness in the chest, hormonal imbalances, rashes, stomach cramps, etc. Our bodies sometimes put on the brakes for a short time and then allow us to return to living at normal speed. In other cases, the symptoms drag on, evading quick fixes, and we have to come to terms with what might be called a chronic illness. And you go on to write about this. So I'm curious to hear more about what you think in terms of our body saying no, because I'm going back to what you said at the beginning of our conversation about, and this is it makes a lot of sense, right? Hot stove, danger, pain comes, right? But this is something more subtle that you're writing about here in terms of our bodies saying no when we are overworking or perhaps in an emotionally traumatic situation. But I'm just curious, how do you see illness and injury in relationship to this aspect of our bodies that says no to whatever is happening in our kind of environmental or circumstances?
Yeah. Well, there's so much evidence now about the way that stress affects our health on so many levels,
Yeah,
like
it's amazing.
our immune system, our hormones,
Mm-hmm.
just so much dysregulation of our whole body. And so when I think about like kind of our symptoms, and if you think about illness or pain or any kind of discomfort in our bodies as a way that our bodies are kind of calling attention to maybe things that we'd rather not deal with, then to me, like that's the rise in so many illnesses, so many invisible like, chronic illnesses in our society, makes me ask, what does this say about how we're living as a society,
Yeah.
and the ways that our pace of life is affecting our ability to thrive and be human and be
Mm-hmm.
whole. And I don't want to I don't want to like say, because this can be another one of those like we like kind of force this narrative onto people like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, you have this autoimmune condition because you've been working too hard and you're like too stressed out, and
Right.
like you just need to like take a break and you'll be better. And that's not always the case. And I mean, like a lot of these like invisible illnesses that I discussed, like fibromyalgia or Hashimoto's or Crohn's, these are like things that happen after decades and decades. And a lot of it is things that we don't have control over, like
Right.
our diet, like eating processed foods, or just, the environment that we're in. So yeah, I think all of those symptoms are ways that we can kind of start to tune in to what's kind of off about the way we live.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, like knowing that we don't live in Eden, so we're not going to make things perfect.
Right.
That's like, I think that's another tendency. So when we start to go into the paying attention to our symptoms as kind of an indicator of lifestyle factors or environmental factors, is that if we have the knowledge and resources, we often want to create like bubbles around ourselves, like bubbles of perfection. Like I will buy all organic foods for my
Right.
kids, and they will eat everything non-processed. All of those sorts of things can be ways that we try to go back to that Eden, and
Right.
this is not what we live in. So it's a really hard balance between like paying attention but then knowing we're not going to fix everything just by ourselves. At least I think this leads into the societal things
Mm-hmm.
that there's we got to start looking to like systemic issues.
Yeah, can you say a little bit more about that? My mind was going in that direction too, but I'd love to hear from you. Because I think you're right. I mean, I think about someone who, I mean, even just a very simple example of developing lung cancer as a result of secondhand smoke. It's one thing, plenty of smokers don't ever develop lung cancer, but even if you say you're a smoker and you develop lung cancer, you can say, okay, cause effect, all within my own body, my fault. And, I wouldn't even say it that simply, but you could.
Yeah.
But in terms of something like secondhand smoke, and again, we can talk about pollution more broadly. We can talk about just what the systems are that lead to eating processed foods. But whole communities are really affected adversely and experience pain and suffering and disease and injury as a result of environmental factors that are certainly not the cause or fault of any one individual, right?
Yeah, for sure. And so something like obesity or heart disease, those are more prevalent among African American communities. And there's this narrative of, oh, they just make bad choices, and they can just teach them to make better choices, and they can go and buy fresh, healthy food. And then we have to look at the food deserts that they live in, or just the fact that they don't have the cost, they don't have the time. They're probably, working long hours. So how are they going to make from scratch meals all the time? So those are all like the bigger picture questions that you start to ask, and you can do that for any issue, any health issue. Like there's, so much of it is a mystery, and I think we can start to say, like, what did we do? And at some point we have to say, well, some of these things, they just happen. But at the same time, there's ways that we can promote the health of communities and groups of people as a whole by starting to peel back those layers of systemic issues.
And did your personal experience of pain, I don't know, change or affect the way you saw communal healing, like both in terms of what the role that the community plays in healing for individuals, but also the role the individual plays in a community when it comes to healing? Can you speak a little bit about that connection between the two in your own experience?
As far as how the first part of your question, how the community plays a role in individual healing, there's this chapter in my book, The Myth of Medical Mastery, where I start to talk about my own seeking healing. At the beginning was all about me going to a doctor and expecting the doctor to fix me. And it was this like individual pursuit that I was on to find the silver bullet to fix my pain. And then I started realizing that I was experiencing healing all along, and it was happening in all these different levels through the friends that I was talking to, through my husband, through the woman that I was praying with at church, and even through my healthcare providers. But it was this bigger kind of healing that involved me realizing that I was part of a community that could support me, so that my healing might not mean me getting better from my pain, but that I realized that whenever I was in a place of need, like whether that was I was moving and I couldn't clean the house before we moved because I was in too much pain. Some friends came and they cleaned our house for us, or I couldn't do laundry. My husband did the laundry.
Right.
I realized that I was part of this bigger body, and then I didn't feel like the bottom was falling out all the time when I was in pain, that I had to like shore up and do it all by myself, or like kind of overcome my liabilities. But I could start to see my own liabilities, if you would call them, as like points of connection, and ways that I was learning to depend on others, learning to be vulnerable, and allowing people. There's a phrase that I quote from a physician named Rachel Naomi Remen, who says, we are all providers of each other's health. And so I was allowing people to provide my health and care for me, and not just seek it for myself. So that's on the community.
And just that relationship between when we acknowledge our limitations instead of trying to like push through them or ignore them or avoid them or even like medicate them, right? But if we just
Yeah.
acknowledge our limits in in a good world, and it doesn't always work this way, of course, because our world is broken and fallen, but and in good relationships, I think what limits can do is open us up to love. And
Yeah.
our desire, my desire, certainly to pretend I don't have limits is what tends to cut me off from love because I
Hmm.
won't accept help and I won't, and then I become more isolated. I feel that pain becomes more of a sense of despair because I can't fix it. And,
Yeah.
and so I get stuck inside myself. But if I can actually admit the limit, ask for help, and exist in a community, whether it's a marriage or friendship or church or whatever, where people can step into the ways in which they've been given abilities to give, there's really some great beauty that can come for everyone in that. And healing, again, not necessarily cessation of pain, but I think great healing that can happen among communities when that happens. I think of that again with I don't know if you've ever read, Henry Nouwen wrote about going and living in the L'Arche community with a man named Adam who was
Yeah.
not in any way going to value Nouwen for his intellectual capacity.
Yeah. Hmm.
And the amount of healing that happened in having a relationship with someone who simply loved him as
Hmm.
a human and not as a professor who was impressive with his language, right?
Hmm.
And that's maybe an extreme example, but those little exchanges that can happen when we are weak and vulnerable, and someone says, "Yeah, I want to be with you in exactly this place, not in
Hmm.
spite of it, but I want to be with you here because I love you." And this is a way of really I mean, the thought of one of my children of not being with them when they're in pain,
Hmm.
like that is so much harder on my heart than the thought of like being with them in pain, even if I can't fix it, right? Because I want to be
Yeah.
there to love them and to let them know that. But as an adult, I think I tend to, again, whether it's physical or emotional, think my job is to cover my pain so that no one else is bothered by it.
Yeah. Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
I'm curious just if there have been any spiritual practices that have either become a part of your life or that you were able to put into your life along the way that helped you to experience healing. Whether there was anything on that kind of mental, spiritual level that enabled you either to return to your body or to attend, to think about it in a different way, or to experience God's presence in a different way.
Yeah. So I have this moment that I think of, and it's funny because you ask about spiritual practice, and this is a physical thing, but I think it was a spiritual practice.
Yeah.
Um, as remember, like a couple years into my pain, taking a bath and suddenly feeling comfortable in my body again,
Mm,
feeling like good in my body. And it was
yeah.
such a healing experience just to receive the feeling of water on my skin and
Mm,
just like float in warmth. And um, so there's a lot of moments like that along the way where I started to be able to enjoy pleasure in my body again
mm-hmm.
that were so healing for me. Like, realizing that my body was still a place where I could connect with people and connect with creation and like give hugs and like take walks. Even if I wasn't like, walking long distances, I could at least like just take in nature and just learning to be present again um, was what enabled me to kind of like heal and be comfortable again in my body. And then as far as like other practices, I've really benefited from meditation, and it's something that I know can kind of like bring up red flags within like Christian spheres, but there's a lot of precedent for um, just that posture of like paying gentle attention to everything around you that is within the Christian tradition too. Centering prayer, or the Jesus prayer, where you're focusing on your breath and just asking Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me. And there's like one of the books on the Jesus Prayer talks about you're bringing your heart like from your mind like down into your heart. So you're like bringing your attention like
Mm-hmm.
down. So like the things that I was able to do that kind of got me out of here in my head where I was just like kind of on like this like repetitive cycle of playing my fears and
Mm.
anxieties over and over into the present moment, and in that moment realizing God was present with me, God is present with me. Those are the most helpful spiritual
Mm-hmm.
practices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm really curious about the relationship between meditation and prayer. And I know the contemplative prayer tradition within Christianity, I think, is the closest
Yeah.
link there. And I know a lot of Christians who have really benefited, myself included, from both contemplative prayer, which I was not taught in my growing up as a Christian, but also from just even more like straightforward meditation that is not,
Yeah.
that is simply about paying attention to the breath or noticing, oh,
Hmm.
my ankle hurts right now. Just
Yeah.
that,
Just
like, can I do that without going into all the fear and anxiety that comes if I fast forward or rewind? Can I just stay
yeah.
with this
Yeah.
right now? Yeah. So when you look back on it and your 21-year-old self, do you now think, oh, such and such thing happened and my ankle started hurting? Or do you see it as a mysterious event that led you on a journey that has helped you become who you are now, or something in between? I mean, I realize I just narrated your own story. I don't mean to do that. I just am curious,
Yeah.
like how you make sense of it now that you not are at the end of it, but at the same time have come to such a different place.
Hmm. In the in my book, I kind of do a rereading of the creation story and
Yeah.
what happened in the fall, as not that pain entered into creation, but that Adam and Eve became newly aware of what their bodies already were, susceptible to pain and fragile and
Mm.
mortal. And I feel like that's what the experience that I had in my 20s was. It wasn't that it was like this like event that um kind of like changed everything, but was like me realizing what was already there. And
Mm-hmm.
it probably would have happened if it didn't happen when I was 21. It would have happened when I was 25 or
Right.
27, and it could have happened through having children. And there's so much vulnerability, and just awareness of our
Yeah.
mortality and our propensity to suffer once you have children. And so that was just like kind of the initial the scales falling off of my
Yeah.
eyes. And maybe it happened for me earlier than other people, but it's something that is just I think is a human experience.
That rings really true to me. I think about the entire year 2020 as this
Mm,
revelation of what was already true, but
yes.
we, for in a variety of different ways and for a variety of different reasons, saw it. Whether that was in these very intimate, I see what is true when it comes to my relationship with food or alcohol, because if I
Hmm.
don't have anywhere to go, that's what I do. Or I see what
Yeah.
is true in my marriage when a little bit of pressure is applied. Or I see what is true in our country when it comes to some of the social unrest that we've had that has seemed more visible in this past
Yeah.
year. I see what is true of our healthcare system, and that some people are far more privileged than others when it comes to the protection from disease. I see, I mean, we could just keep that list going, but I
Hmm.
think that there is a grace that can come from that awareness if we invite God into it, not in the sense of it all gets fixed, but in that sense of, oh, if this was true and I didn't know about it, and now I do, then there is an ability to live in that reality and invite joy and love and peace even into that place that maybe there wouldn't have been if I continued to deny that reality, which I know has been what I've done for a lot of my life. It's just trying to muscle through according to the productive and efficient and able bodied ways I've been taught.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we so want to keep going. I was having a discussion group with my book launch team about this
Mm,
book, and I asked what keeps us from being kind of sitting with our vulnerability and in those places where we see how what is true about ourselves, and then we just are like, no, I'm not going to look at that. I'm just going to keep going. And one woman said she had children, a couple of children with learning disabilities, and so in their early years, she was just shuttling them back and forth to different appointments and things. And she mentioned if I had kind of allowed myself to feel all the things that I was, feeling under the surface, I think I would have just, my fear was that I would have melted into a puddle and like
hmm
never been able to get up again. So I think there's a level of like, oh, it's like we want to shield ourselves from that because it feels like it's just gonna like squash us to the
Yeah,
ground because it's so heavy.
right.
And I think that's what I came to in my book is that, and I mean not in the writing of the book, but just in the processing before I got to writing the book is like that place of like utter vulnerability and realizing how human we are in our human condition. Like you said, is the place where healing happens. Like we have to be willing to go to that place in order to move forward. And that doesn't mean overcome, but it means like to find a better way forward. Or else we're just gonna be like kind of pushing the trauma and the the feelings under the surface, unprocessed.
Well, and if something that is just true about who God is that God is a healer, and I mean that in the more holistic sense, not in the fixing and curing, then there is a sense of if we open ourselves up to healing, then we are also freed to participate both in the healing work that God's doing in our own lives and the healing work that I believe God wants to do in all the different examples that came up in this conversation, whether it's simply within a church community or a family or in the broader social, all the dividing lines that can be repaired, that could be healed. If we can experience that and believe it personally, which involves admitting places of pain and brokenness and vulnerability, then I think it does open us up to be a part of something bigger and see some of that gentle, loving work around us.
Yeah, it opens us up to new possibilities if we can kind of let go of those narratives that we've had.
Well, I think that is a good place to end this conversation in hope for possibilities as we are willing and aware to look at brokenness and limitation and then see what God can do in the midst of it. So thank you for being here today. I really appreciate your time.
Really enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks so much for listening to Love is Stronger Than Fear. As I mentioned at the beginning, we are excited to give away a copy of Liuan's new book, Hurting Yet Whole. To enter for your chance to win, just rate and review this podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and just send me a message to let me know that you've done it. Once I hear from you, you'll be entered in the giveaway. You can contact me through comments or messages on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter, or via the contact page on my website, amyjuliabecker.com. All the details for this giveaway, as well as all the other references we mentioned in our conversation, will be in the show notes as well. I finally want to thank our co-host, Breaking Ground. If you want more podcasts and articles and videos that reflect from a Christian perspective on how to think about the past, understand the present, and explore redemptive possibilities for the future, visit breakingground.us. Thanks also again to Jake Hansen for editing this podcast, to Amber Beery, my social media coordinator, who does more to support this show than anyone will ever know. And join us next week. I'll be talking again about hope and healing with Catherine Wolfe, and I hope you'll join us. As you go into your day today, I do hope you will carry with you the peace that comes from believing that love is stronger than fear.